All right, the next React design pattern we're going to take a look at is the pattern of custom hooks. So what are custom hooks? Well, custom hooks are basically when instead of just using the basic hooks that React provides us with, such as useState and useEffect, we actually combine these hooks into our own new hooks. So what this might look like is, let's say we want our component to have access to products from the server. Well, we could either create the product state and actually load the products inside the component itself, or we could create our own custom useProducts hook that encapsulates this functionality. We're going to see how to do this very shortly, but this that you see here is what custom hooks will generally look something like. When we use custom hooks, right, once we've created our custom useProducts hook, useUsers hook, whatever kind of resource or functionality we're trying to encapsulate in that hook, the way we use it in our component is usually like what you see here. We just say const products equals and then our custom hook. And one thing to note is that custom hooks do have to start with the word use. Okay, that's just something that React requires us to do, and it has to do with the way that hooks work behind the scenes. But we won't get into that right now. So custom hooks are used for pretty much the same thing that we've seen with higher order components and container components. They're used to allow us to share complex behavior between several different components, right? Like what I said before, if we want to, say, load products from a server, instead of having to specify that same loading logic over and over again, we can put that logic into a custom hook and simply use the hook in each of our components. So now that we know the basics behind custom hooks in React, let's see what they actually look like and how we can add them to our React applications. For this example, we're going to be doing basically the same thing that we've done before with our container components and our higher order components. We're going to start off by seeing how to load a current user from the server. And by the way, you're going to want to get the starting state of this from the exercise files if you're following along. So we're going to start off by seeing how to load the current user from the server, and then we're going to expand this to be able to load any user from the server, and this will be followed by seeing how to load different resources, and finally we'll top that off by seeing how to create custom hooks that can work with any kind of data source. So again, similar to what we did with container components. So to get started, you're going to want to first run the server by saying node server.js, and then we'll open up another terminal or just another tab in your terminal, and run our React app by saying npm run start. Okay, and now that we have both our front end and back end running, let's create a new file for our first custom hook. Now remember that custom hooks need to start with the word use, so we're going to call this custom hook useCurrentUser. And what it's going to do is allow whatever component uses it to have access to the current user that we're going to load from the server. So let's create that file, and our custom hook is going to look something like this. We're going to say export const useCurrentUser. And custom hooks are really just functions that call other hooks. So the next thing we're going to do is import a few things up at the top. We're going to start off by importing useState and useEffect from React. And we're also going to import Axios since we'll be loading some data from the server here. Okay, and let's create a user state variable here by saying const user and set user equals useState. And then just like we've seen before, we're going to have the initial value of our user be null while we're loading it. And then we'll use our useEffect hook to actually load that user. And let's make sure to add an empty array as the second argument so that it doesn't get called every time the component that's using this custom hook updates. And inside this useEffect hook, we're going to create and call an asynchronous function like this. And this is going to be just like what we've seen several times already. We're going to say const response equals await axios.get. The endpoint for the current user is going to be /current-user. And under that, we're going to say set user to response.data. Okay, and let's call this asynchronous function. And the last thing we need to do now is define what the component that actually calls this custom hook is going to have access to, right? In other words, what data are we going to give it? And to do that, all we have to do is say return user. So this basically means that when another component uses this useCurrentUser hook, it's going to look like this. They're just going to say const current user equals useCurrentUser. And this value will be equal to the current state that we have for user inside our custom hook. All right, so that's pretty much all we need to do for this custom hook. Now let's see how to use it. So we have our user info and product info components that we created earlier in the course. So let's open up our user info component and see how to add this custom hook. Okay, so when we created this component earlier, we made it so that user was passed in as a prop. So that's usually from the parent component. Now, this is often what we're going to want to do since we'll want user info to be able to display different users based on where it's being displayed in the page. However, just to get a feel for how this useCurrentUser hook is going to work, I'm going to remove this prop for now. Okay, so we see that we're getting the red underline under user. What we're going to do now is import this custom hook. We're going to say import useCurrentUser from useCurrentUser. And up here at the top of our component, we're going to say const user equals useCurrentUser. And that should be all we need to do. So let's just display this user info inside our app component now. All right, so we're going to import it. Import user info from user info. And then display that component inside our app component by saying user info. And now if we go back to our browser, we're going to see that the current user, which is in our current user endpoint on our server, is displayed inside the user info component. So that's how you create a very simple custom hook in React. All right, so we've seen the basics now of creating custom hooks. So what we're going to do next is take our useCurrentUser hook that we created and modify it a little bit so that we can make it load any user we want from the server. So here's what this is going to look like. We're going to start off by creating a new file, and we'll call this file useUser.js. And for the code here, we're going to start off by just copying and pasting our useCurrentUser custom hook that we created. There we go. And the changes we're going to make are going to look like this. We're going to start off, of course, by renaming our custom hook to useUser. And this custom hook, since remember that custom hooks are just functions, this custom hook is going to take an argument, which will be the ID of the user that we want to load from the server. Okay, and from there, really the only other thing we have to do is change the URL that we're sending this request to. Okay, we're going to use backticks and say /users/ and then insert the user ID argument into that URL. And then we just need to add user ID to the useEffectsArray argument here so that basically this useEffect will refresh and reload the user if the ID of the user changes. And that's pretty much all we need to do. So let's go back now to our user info component and take a look at how to actually use this useUser custom hook. Okay, so when we used useCurrentUser, I pointed out that this does make this component a little bit less flexible, right? Since we're no longer able to pass in whatever user we want. We're pretty much constrained to just having the current user here. But what we can do, now that we have a useUser custom hook, is we can import that one instead. Okay, we're going to say import useUser from useUser. And then we're going to use the useUser custom hook instead of useCurrentUser. And the way that we're going to get the user ID that we'll pass in to the arguments here is through a prop that will be passed to user info. So this will allow us to basically reuse this user info component for different users, since we'll just be able to render user info with different values for the user ID prop. Okay? So now that we have the user ID prop, we're just going to pass that through to our custom hook. And then going back to our app component, we're going to see how we should do this. So we have user info imported already. Let's just display several user info components with different user IDs. So the first one here will have user ID 123. the second one here will have user ID 234, and we'll have one more, which will be for user ID 345. And that's all there is to it. Let's take a look now at our app, and we see that sure enough, our user info component is using that custom hook that we created to load 3 different people from the server. Okay, so we saw how to refactor a custom hook to make it more reusable with our useUser custom hook. Let's take this a step further now and create a custom hook that will allow us to load any kind of resource. So here's what this is going to look like. We're going to start off by creating a new file, and we're going to call this custom hook useResource.js. And again, we're going to start off by just copying and pasting the state of the last hook that we created. Okay, and we're going to make a few changes here. So first of all, let's change the name of this custom hook to useResource, like that. And then instead of having our state variable be called user, we're just going to have it called resource and set resource. And then down here, what we're going to do is instead of sending a GET request directly to the /users URL, we're going to remove that and allow ourselves to pass in the URL that we want to load the resource from as an argument to our custom hook. So the argument here, we'll call it resource URL, and then we'll simply pass that URL to axios.get. Okay, and then we just have to change this to set resource, change user ID here to resource URL, and change return user to return resource. Okay, so what we're able to do now is use this useResource custom hook in a pretty similar way to how we used our useUser custom hook, except with useResource. Here, let me show you what it'll look like if we import it and then use it down here. We're going to say const user equals useResource, and all we have to do here is just pass the URL of the resource. So in our case here, that's going to be /users/ and we'll pass in the user ID prop like that. Now this should work exactly like it did before, right? We see that nothing's changed. But the nice thing about this useResource custom hook now is that we can use it to load basically anything else we want. So let's open up the product info component that we had from earlier and see how we can use the useResource custom hook to load products as well. So let's start off by importing useResource from useResource. And what we're going to do is instead of passing in the product as a prop to product info, we're just going to pass in the product ID. We're going to use this in exactly the same way that we did with the user info component. So here's what this will look like now. We're going to say const product equals useResource, and then we just need to specify the URL of the product that we want to load. So that's going to be /products/ and we're going to insert the product ID into there, like that. And that's all there is to it. Let's head over to our app component now, and we can leave the user info components the way they are. In fact, let's just remove one or two of them so we can see the product info one more clearly. Let's import product info up at the top here. Import product info from product info, and display it by saying product info. And for the product ID, let's just pass in one of the IDs that we have on our server, such as 1234. Okay, so let's take a look at this and see if it worked. It looks like in product info, we just have to add something to make sure that product actually exists. So we'll add that there, like that. And that should be all we need to do. So we see that our product is indeed being displayed, and really all we had to do to add that functionality to this product info component was use this useResource custom hook that we created, right? So this is much easier than the way that most React developers would normally go about it, which would be to basically import useState, create a new state hook here by saying const product, set product, etc., right? And then actually using a useEffect hook directly inside the component. So to sum all that up, this useResource custom hook allows us to quickly and easily load any server-side resource inside any component. All right, so we made our custom hook very, very reusable and flexible by creating this useResource custom hook. What we're going to do here is take it one step further and allow ourselves to specify any data source for our components with a custom hook. This is going to be very similar to what we did earlier with our container components. So let's start off by creating a new file for our new hook here, and we're going to call this new hook useDataSource.js. And as usual, we're going to start off by copying and pasting the last custom hook that we created. And here's what this is going to look like. So instead of specifying a resource URL for ourselves here, what we're going to do is allow ourselves to pass in a function that will specify how exactly to get the data. Right? This function is basically going to tell our custom hook where to find the data. So we'll call this function getResource function, like that. And of course, we need to change the name of our custom hook here. So we'll say useDataSource. And we're going to leave everything else pretty much the same except for this part inside our asynchronous function. What this is going to do is instead of saying await axios.get, which is very specific to loading data from the server, right? We want to make it a little more generic. We're going to say await getResource function, just like that. Okay, and for setResource, we're just going to say setResource to response. And in fact, let's rename this from response to result or something like that, since response is also very specific to getting data from a server. Okay, and for the array argument for useEffect, we're going to change this to getResource function, like that. And we're returning the resource. Okay, so let's see how this is going to work now. Let's head over to our user info, and let's import our useDataSource custom hook, like that. And then what we're going to do is instead of using useResource, we're going to say const user equals useDataSource. And we're going to want to specify that we want to get the data from the server. Now, the way we do that is we basically pass a function as an argument to our useDataSource custom hook that will contain the logic that we basically removed when we change this to say await getResource function. So we're going to start off here by importing Axios. Import Axios from Axios. And what we're going to do is say const response equals await axios.get. And then we'll say /users/ and insert the user ID. Oh, and this should be an asynchronous function here. So say async at the beginning. And then we'll say return response.data. Okay, so this response.data that we're returning is the exact location of the data that we're trying to get. Okay, so if we go back to our browser and take a look, we should see that nothing has changed with our user info component. Now, at first glance, this useDataSource custom hook probably looks a little more complicated than our useResource custom hook, right? Well, what we could do is specify a new function up at the top here that will actually create variations of this asynchronous function inside of here for us, right? So if we wanted to do something like load products instead, we could simply use this function to do that instead of having to type out the same code over and over again. Let me show you what I mean. We're going to say const, and we'll call this function something like server resource. All right, and this is going to be a function that returns a function. So server resource is going to take one argument, which will be the URL of the resource that we want to load from the server. And it's basically going to return this asynchronous function that we defined inside of here. So let's just cut that out and paste it here. Okay. And then we're just going to replace this hard-coded URL here with the resource URL that we passed in to the first set of arguments. And what this will allow us to do is say useDataSource server resource and pass in the URL that we want to load the data from. Okay, so we could say /users/user ID. And this here is much simpler and more configurable than what we saw before. Because what we can do is, again, let's say we have some data in local storage. We could simply define another function here called local storage resource. We'd specify the key where that resource is stored in local storage, and we would return a function, which doesn't have to be async since local storage is synchronous. And we could simply say return local storage dot get item key. And that would be all we need to do. So if we wanted to load something from local storage, like if we had a message in local storage, let's say, we could say const message equals useDataSource local storage resource instead of server resource, and then simply pass in the key, which would be something like message, presumably. Okay, and by having useDataSource and server resource separate, what we're able to do is actually have this custom hook with all of its functionality and configure it by passing in other functions that tell the custom hook how to actually get the data. Now, in reality, you might not want to go this far, right? useResource would probably be a good stopping point, but nevertheless, there are some applications where this kind of thing and having this kind of configurability can be very helpful.